and then bigot. Sorry.
Kia ora, everyone. You'll recall meeting me in the very first session of this fabulous trade policy course. I'm really sorry I can't be with you this morning, but we're teaching Manaaki scholars from the Pacific Islands at the same time here in Auckland, and we're taking them to meet some government officials this morning. So I'm pre-recording this by a couple of hours, and if you have any questions at all, please feel free to put them in the discussion board on Canvas, and I'll come back to them tomorrow when we meet again to talk Indigenous trade and to follow up on gender inclusive trade. But today what we're doing is introducing the concept of inclusive trade. So I'll get started. If I can change my screen. Here we go. So as always, we'll begin with a karakia. I'm not sure if the team will have done this first. So we just, as you'll know, it's custom here to say a karakia to settle us in advance of beginning our mahi or our work together. Tu taua mai ki runga, tu taua mai ki raro, tu taua mai ki roto, tu taua mai ki waho, kai tau ai te mori tu, te mori ora, ki te katoa, homi e, hui e, dai ki e. So today's agenda, what we're going to do is cover off the history, the rationale and the objectives of the concept of inclusive trade. And we'll have a brief look at inclusive trade and practice and the recent initiatives we've seen implemented here in New Zealand. There will do a bit, I'll play you a video that I recorded with one of the lead trade officials in the Agriculture and Trade for SMEs Directorate at the OECD. And some of you will know that the OECD has a really strong interest in the Latin American region and the Caribbean region. And so Jane Koronek and I had a conversation at the OECD about inclusive trade, which we recorded. And I've put the link here for you so that the team can play it for you. And then after that video, you're going to go into breakout rooms and do some work on looking at the initiatives on inclusive trade that are happening in your space. And you can report back to the team on that, and the whole thing will be recorded. And I'll be able to look at it later today, my time, and we can follow up again in person tomorrow. So Thursday, my time, and probably Wednesday afternoon, your time. So apologies if I'm getting the time zones wrong. So what I wanted to start with is a brief history, if you like, of inclusive trade and where this concept came from. So what we see here is the list of public forum, which previously were called the Publican Symposium, that were held by or sponsored by the WTO forum. So this public forum happens at the WTO in Geneva, usually in September every year. I have colleagues from the Māori community who are trade experts who go to this on a regular basis. It's one of those things that once you're part of the group, you want to keep going back because that's the way you build your networks. But this wasn't always the way with the WTO. It used to be a much more traditionally focused organisation on trade issues, and certainly it wasn't really that interested in public input. And yet public input into what's needed to advance trade and development, economic growth and so on really needs to come from the people most affected. So we see the WTO taking some initiatives or baby steps, if you like, towards opening itself up to public conversations By public, we don't obviously mean the general public, but we need more than what we see as an inclusion of more than just the traditional trade agreement or trade experts and stakeholders. This is a broader reach. It includes representatives from civil society organisations and small and medium enterprises alongside government officials and so on. So the public forum begins in 2001. So it's only just over 20 years old. And for a long time, the first decade, if you like, the focus of the public forums was still on very traditional understandings of what trade issues were about. So you can sort of see that multilateralism was a topic in 2004, globalization and WTO in 2007, what forces were shaping the world and trade in 2010. But then we start to see some movement in the mid 2010s. So we see in 2014 why trade matters to everyone. And so we're starting to move towards this concept of thinking about trade and trade matters and who trade matters for as being a much more eclectic and expansive understanding. And then you'll see, so that's sort of the first one. And then in 2016, we see the topic of inclusive trade reaches the agenda. And as you come forward in time, you can see this more expansive understanding of trade continues. So in 2022, a sustainable and inclusive recovery of trade post-COVID, given supply chains and so on. We know what happened during COVID. So you see this shift over time with the way the global governance structures around trade are thinking about the who in trade. And so this concept of inclusive trade becomes more common within this environment, but also within the EU, who is a leader in this space, and other jurisdictions. So we see the focus within the public forums beginning to shift towards topics or issues of transparency, of recognising values and cultural contexts, and of sharing the benefits and communicating the importance of these benefits to a wider population base, because and I'll come to why this became really important in a moment. In a way, the EU was one of the leading groups of trading countries to really engage with the notion of trade for all as a strategy. It was endorsed, that the conversation started in 2015, and it was endorsed by the EU Parliament as strategy in 2016. But we also see other international organisations and jurisdictions moving on this notion of trade for all or inclusive trade. So the OECD starts to have conversations about the need for diversifying the types of businesses that are engaged in trade. This is where we start to see more discussions on the importance of women in trade and how to bring the informal economy into the formal economy to enable many of those women-led enterprises to participate in trade and trade growth. Sorry, I'm just going to move the record button over here a bit. So we also see that the language of trade and trade for all, inclusive trade, starts to flow through to the ministerials, to declarations, and now we see, as you'll know, specific chapters in trade agreements on Indigenous trade, on women in trade and women's economic empowerment, but also on sustainability and green trade, green chapters, and so on. So this has now become a standing operating practice, if you like, to be considering these broader understandings of who benefits, who should be involved, these who questions, bringing people into trade agreements, that are beyond the traditional ministers and their advisors and negotiators and so on. And there are really specific reasons for why we come to see this initiative, which I obviously will come back to. So my slides might not be in the order that I thought they were. So I'll finish with the definitional work and then move into the why work. So what we know about the concept of inclusive trade is that it's developed over these past 10 years, and it's come to recognize include three core elements. So the first element is the recognition of excluded groups, and this includes marginalized communities, for Aotearoa New Zealand, that's our Indigenous peoples, Māori, who have long since been traders, and we'll come back to Indigenous trade tomorrow. And I know that this is a topic that's really important for your economies as well. And you, like us in Canada and Australia, are sort of leading the way in this space. It tends to be something that for some time had been quite an anathema, I think, to Europe and to the EU, even though they were leaders on trade for all. So the three core elements of inclusive trade focus on the recognition of excluded groups through participation in the trade process, as I've mentioned, and the negotiations and the discussions about other aspects of trade, and sharing the benefits of trade, whether this be direct to those who are traders, or more indirectly to general population groups. The second is a recognition of the key issues that impact inclusion, like labour market stratification, like labour market standards, growth strategies, digital and sustainable trade. These are, the way in which the informal and formal economies interact. All of these key issues impact the extent to which inclusive trade is possible. And third is that processes around transparency become, particularly during the negotiation process and what the national interest is identified as when you're negotiating trade agreements, but also the implementation thereof domestically as well as internationally after agreements are signed. And then transparency back to civil society, to communities, to those who are not directly engaged in the process is really important, as is the use of disaggregated data so that we have a really strong understanding of who will be impacted positively and potentially negatively by the way in which we are organising multilateral trade or bilateral trade options, and the idea that expanded stakeholder consultations prior, during and post-negotiation is important. So this idea of inclusive trade isn't just about the trade negotiation process. It's about what happens after trade agreements or initiatives have taken place, and how that is activated domestically or implemented through policies at the domestic level to support ongoing inclusion. So not seeing it as a one-off, but seeing it as a process that continues throughout the life to enable more people to engage. So why did we see this agenda for inclusive trade emerge? Well, as I've already mentioned, partly it was about creating better outcomes. So not just the trade agreement or the trade initiatives are outputs, but translating those into meaningful, say, well-being, economic growth, broader public understanding of the value of trade. Those are the outcomes that we want to see. And the benefits of trade, they wanted to spread them more widely across communities, but also recognise that governments needed to explain and communicate the benefits of trade in a more inclusive way. There was also a recognition that the shift to globalisation throughout the 80s and the 90s, and the sort of neoliberal agenda, if you like, that had come with that domestically in some economies was really challenging for many communities. And there have been negative impacts on some economies of trade liberalisation. It wasn't an equitable process in terms of economy to economy processes, but also within economies. And so we see really a lot of negative impacts on labour rights, on environmental sustainability, because of this full-on liberalisation process that wasn't giving consideration to the who in sufficient way. And partly as a result of these negatives, we start to see significant increase in anti-free trade agreement protests globally. So we had some really big protests here in New Zealand. I'm sure you have in your economies as well. So moving towards this concept and practice of inclusive trade became a political necessity, of recognizing that open and trading economies are better, more likely to enhance economic development and economic growth in a sustainable way, required a more inclusive approach if FTAs were going to be signed. And we've seen a proliferation of bilaterals over the years since inclusive trade has come about, and we've seen a lot more chapters dealing with the importance of inclusion. So we also start to see a shift, I think academically, like within my sphere, but also in practice, a clearer recognition that trade isn't just a sort of an international relations issue, that it's a topic that impacts domestic agendas and internal or domestic legal obligations, as well as geopolitical, broader international relations connections that provide economic and foreign policy security. So there's sort of an expanded understanding of where trade as a topic sits in our Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade, which by all our students, think that it's going to be really glamorous to go and work for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade and get a posting somewhere really cool. And in that process, they might learn to become junior trade negotiators and so on. But the reality is we also need domestic officials to understand the strengths and weaknesses of agreements, of legal obligations, and of the implementation processes that follow the signing of a trade agreement. So we do start to see influence of other international and domestic instruments and actions. We come back to this when we talk about Indigenous trade. We can think of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, for example, is really important instrument to protect Indigenous economies and to enable Indigenous to Indigenous trade. It also, we see over the last 10 years, a growing focus on connections between the SDGs and trade and inclusive trade, and also trade growth with the global south and south to south trading relationships. So, and one last thing that I wanted to include, is there's now, I would argue, a strong, that the concept and practice of inclusive trade has become a really important currency, if you like, in the process of negotiating trade agreements. So New Zealand recently signed a trade agreement with United Arab Emirates, and as part of that, our government needed to do some work in the gender trade space, in terms of the negotiations, because of our domestic commitments, because of our commitments in other trade agreements. And so the chapters, while there isn't a sort of explicit chapter on gender and trade, for example, or inclusive trade, There are sections within chapters on women's economic empowerment and a commitment in the trade agreement with UAE on a recognition of the importance of international declarations like CEDAW, so the Convention for the Elimination of all forms of discrimination against women. So we see now that this concept and practice and the chapters associated with inclusive trade have gained currency, and it's pretty rare, I would say, to see a new agreement being discussed without some reference to inclusive trade, whether in the lead up to, during and post negotiation. And I think this is standing the test of the current rise in populism. It will be interesting to see if this emphasis on inclusive trade will continue, but for now we are seeing it as something that's resilient to the rise in populism and politics. So New Zealand's had a trade for all agenda since 2018. We adopted the language of trade for all, perhaps in part because we had begun conversations with the EU around a possible trade agreement, and the trade for all language is language that is used by the EU. So, we talk about this regularly in our short courses of the importance of how we frame the challenging policy issues that sometimes sit with negotiations like this. So in New Zealand's case, the trade for all agenda was a really important and necessary step to get the trade agreements that our governments were looking for, like the Trans-Pacific Partnership, but also expanding our reach post-Brexit with the UK and with the EU. And what this and this is, as you'll see from the photograph, this is one of our anti-TPP Trans-Pacific Partnership trade agreements that fell in. But you can see here that the numbers of people on the streets of Auckland was significant, and other cities as well. Really strong presence of Indigenous Māori peoples resisting this trade agreement and the risks associated for them in protecting their whenua, their land, their taonga, so their treasures, whether that be forests, whether that be intellectual property and cultural icons and so on. And we'll talk more about this tomorrow. So what we see happen as a result of adopting this trade for all agenda, in the face of anti-international trade kind of protests, was a really strong commitment to very wide-ranging public stakeholder and Māori consultation and representation that focused on environmental issues such as climate change, on protecting New Zealanders' health and well-being. So this is around the trade in pharmaceuticals and so on. And this is all before COVID, right? When we know that being able to access health supplies becomes, and supply chains more generally, not just in health supplies and technology, but also food and all sorts of things, like the supply chain issue during COVID really became a challenge. So this idea of protecting domestic populations became much more foregrounded, labour rights and gender equity, and boosting small to medium enterprise participation in international markets as traders. And so for New Zealand, this is really important. We don't have a large number of very large corporations in our economy. Most of ours are small enterprises and medium-sized, sort of middling number of those. But really important was the rights of Indigenous peoples, protecting traditional knowledges, intellectual property, and so on. So I've put a link here to a video that was made by MFAT for New Zealand, for New Zealanders' consumption, if you like. And there's a couple of, there's an MFAT working report there which came out of the consultation process. So I was part of that consultation process on the trade for all. I'm going to say it's a chapter, but not in the sense of the trade agreement chapter, but in this report on women in trade and gender and trade. And it was really interesting actually because, women in trade and gender analysis, bringing gender analysis to trade and trade negotiations and impacts and so on are not the same thing. And so we ended up having quite interesting conversations about whether in this there should be sort of thinking about women as traders and women included in trade, and then also making sure that agreements and practices and rules had a gender lens brought on them. So Kemi is going to talk with you more about these two dimensions tomorrow, but for now I just want to say that in this process of consultation, of which I was a part, these were the kind of conversations in the room that were had. And, to be fair, the Secretariat for the Trade for All initiative were really good at representing and reporting back the full nature of the conversations that were held by those who were involved in those conversations and consultations. So moving on then to the OECD's inclusive trade agenda, I want to, I'll let the team play this video with Jane Koronek in a moment, and I will sign off. I'll introduce your breakout room activity next, and then push play on this, and they can take you into the breakout room activity. But before I did that, I wanted to say, so this, I'll give you some context to the recording. So I've been working on the topic of women in trade for some years now. Primarily, my interest is in how these actors in international organizations have, like Jane, have been helping to promulgate the importance of inclusive trade with a focus on gender and trade. And so I recorded this a few years back, so I don't look like that anymore, obviously. Jane is still there doing really important work in the Trade Directorate. She's quite high up, but very grounded in her knowledge and understanding of inclusive trade. Since then, so what we know is Jane came out to New Zealand and did a review of our gender and trade processes and so on, which was a report like this one. So just recently, last year, I was back at the OECD, and Jane and her senior colleagues and Matthias Cormann, who is the Secretary General of the OECD, were launching this report, the Trade and Gender Review of Latin America. So while Caribbean is not in there, I thought it was really interesting. So I've put this Trade and Gender Review document up for you on Canvas. You can probably find the launch of this review and who spoke at it at the OECD from last year. So I feel like it's kind of fortuitous or accidentally helpful that Jane has done this review of New Zealand, that I've gotten to talk with her about her work in the inclusive trade space. And then a couple of years later, I'm at the launch of the Trade and Gender Review. It was synchronicity or, fortuitous. It wasn't planned. So it's very cool. The Trade and Gender Review of Latin America has some really great, it's like 133 pages. So you won't want to be reading the whole thing all at once, but you can word search it as a PDF if you have particular interests in relation to trade and gender as an example of inclusive trade. Tomorrow we'll come back to the work that the OECD has been doing in the Indigenous trade space. But what I wanted to do just was to, and Kemi will probably talk to you about the GTAG agreement, which has got quite a few Latin American chapter countries included. But what I wanted to do is just read out to you a little paragraph from this trade and gender review, which I think speaks to the commitment that Latin American and Caribbean countries have had to inclusive trade for some decades now. So Latin American countries have led other regions in incorporating gender chapters and gender-related provisions in their trade agreements. Since 2016, when Chile and Uruguay the Chile-Uruguay trade agreement was the first ever to include a gender chapter. And of the 87 trade agreements signed by Argentina, Brazil, Chile, Colombia, Costa Rica, Mexico, and Peru, 40 of those contain gender explicit provisions. So, and all the countries included in this trade and gender review are included or have joined the Global Trade and Gender Arrangement, GTAG, which Kemi will probably talk more about tomorrow. So I just wanted to read that out to sort of underscore that your economies are leaders in the space of inclusive trade, and in a way, set the scene through your Indigenous peoples' work with UNDRIPS alongside ours and that of Canada, that perhaps it is definitely not surprising that we see that the members of GTAG, for example, the Global Gender Trade Arrangement, the economies where we see Indigenous people's action and as well as women's asking for inclusive trade. So before I ask the team to play this video, I wanted to just share with you what we'd like you to do in your breakout rooms. And Juanita and Suzanne will facilitate the feedback or the report back from your breakout rooms. And then I will listen to that and look at that in advance of our session together tomorrow. So what the reviews and processes of inclusive trade chapters really focus on is thinking about the opportunities that trade agreements can bring and how you will identify those post trade agreement negotiation will involve the importance of collecting good data and doing good consultation, but also thinking about the nature of your economy and the way in where Indigenous, marginalised and women sit in your economy is often in micro and small businesses. And so what we want you to do is to look at find examples of opportunities that exist for micro and small businesses to participate in trade development discussions. So in the consultation process, in that process of growing public understanding of the value of trade. And secondly, look at how is diverse and disaggregated data collected in your economies and then used to support the inclusion of MSMEs in your newer trade initiatives. So realizing that even though trade agreements get signed, that's never the end of the process. There are always reviews. Sometimes there are revisions, but we need to be ensuring as officials engaged in this process that the ongoing opportunities for making the best use of agreements for our domestic traders is important. So I will, after you've watched the video, a conversation with Jane and I'd like you to jump into the breakout rooms and do this work. And so for now, that's it from me. And once again, my apologies, I can't be with you online in person, but I will see you tomorrow and we can pick up and discuss these topics further when we move into Indigenous trade. Kia ora. Thank you. And it'll just take me a minute to stop sharing my screen and turn off my recording. Mā te wā.
So now we will play the recording, the next recording. I have it ready, Sus, if you want me to play it. You're muted.
Lost my cursor. What happens when I've got too many screens?
So should I play it?
Yes, please.
Okay, give me a second with sound. Can you see it now?
Yes.
Okay.
Kia ora tātou katoa, a tūtahi e mihi ana kia koutou katoa, koutou kua huihuinga I tēnei rā. Koutou kua taumai ki te wā, tēnā koutou, kia ora mai anō koutou katoa. Warm Pacific greetings also to our whanaunga from the Pacific. Thank you very much for joining us. I've been asked to introduce quite simply the next session. It's a conversation between Jennifer Curtin and Jane Koronek of the OECD, and then we'll lead into the next panel discussion. Thank you.
Kia ora, Jane. I'm going to introduce you to our audience. So Jane Koronek is an economist here and trade policy analyst in the OECD, the Organisation of Economic Cooperation and Development here in Paris. And Jane leads the OECD's work on inclusive trade, and her recent policy research examines how trade impacts women and men differently and how trade policies can support women's economic empowerment. She's also engaged in research on the regulation of extractive industries, the circular economy, global value chains, services, regional trade agreements, trade costs, and trade finance. So an expert in all things trade. So thank you so much for joining us today.
My pleasure.
So to begin, inclusive trade. Trade for all, it's become an important focus for trade and trade policy in Aotearoa and New Zealand, as you know, over the past 5 years or more. Mm-hmm. But it's also a critical area of interest for the OECD. So can you walk us through when this topic became an issue for the OECD and why and how? Just sort of a broad overview.
Sure. So the first paper that I wrote on trade and gender was actually in 2005. But it was decided by the OECD Trade Committee at that point that we would not be pursuing work on that. So we actually started working on trade and gender in kind of as a theme of our work in 2020. Okay. And we started working on Indigenous peoples and trade in 2022. So that is, this biennium. We work on a 2-year biennium basis, our work plan. And that is this biennium, for the first time, we're working on Indigenous peoples and trade. We worked a little bit more widely on micro and small enterprises starting in about 2015 or 2016. And really, I think all of the question around inclusive trade has come through because there is a realization that the aggregate outcomes of trade are no longer what we need to be focusing on. We know the benefits of trade. We know that more trade brings more growth. Mm-hmm. We know that more trade brings lower prices through greater specialization. It brings a sharing of technological change, of new technologies, and it brings new networks. So the overall aggregate benefits of trade, I think, are well understood. We at the OECD have been making that case for decades, mm-hmm. and they're fairly well understood. Mm-hmm. However, trade does not lift all boats. Mm-hmm. And so, it is important to better understand who the winners and losers of a trade policy or a trade agreement will be. Are they women? Are they small businesses? Urban versus rural dwellers, men and women, indigenous communities, and better understanding the impacts of trade on different communities also means that we can better put into place complementary policies in order to not increase inequality or bring certain gaps that we are not looking for from a public policy perspective.
Yeah. So given the role the OECD plays in generating research and promulgating knowledge and policy learning, how does your organisation differentiate between what counts as international relations, and I know that you have expertise in the international economy, but also that domestic level of public policy?
Yeah, so there's been quite a change in the trade space in this area. So when we think back at the WTO informal working group on micro, small, and medium enterprises met for the first time in 2018. That now seems incredible that it wasn't before, right? And even today, it's an informal working group. So it's not, a fully mandated, resourced committee.
Right.
The WTO Informal Working Group on Trade and Gender met for the first time in 2020.
Okay.
So that's only, a few years ago. So the idea there is that we are bringing more issues into the trade space. And this has started some time ago with issues like trade and environment, trade and labor, and now more recently trade and gender, and even trade and indigenous peoples. There will be the first chapter on trade and indigenous peoples in a trade agreement coming out. I think in the process of finalization. So as regards kind of specific provisions, say on gender, for example. It really depends how far countries want to go. If you look at some cooperation agreements or cooperation provisions within trade agreements, countries will be discussing elements of gender equality that are more focused at the domestic level, but those discussions will happen in the context of a trade agreement. So, for example, cooperation provisions where countries discuss things like the gender wage gap and how to close gender wage gaps. Other countries will be pushing further. We know in some aid for trade programs, they actually tackle some aspects that are seemingly untrade related, like violence against women. So it really depends on the country level, I would say, on the countries involved and how far they want to go into the domestic policy space. But that's something that is changing, and we're seeing more and more policy space within trade policy.
Yeah, and it seems like that's a really important initiative, just to enable those who are not experts in trade understand that trade still matters for them, personally or as communities and so on. And I think we'll come back to that with our final question. So carrying on with this theme of gender and trade and the work of the OECD, when we think about gender analysis and advancing women in trade and business and SMEs and micro enterprises and so on, there's as you say, a whole bunch of other areas. This means that within the OECD, gender and work on gender is going to be more of a horizontal issue across work streams, perhaps?
So our work at OECD has been looking at, in the trade and gender space, we started by looking at developing a framework of analysis, looking at the major impacts that impact women and men differently, the major trade impacts that affect men and women differently. And we applied that to our first pilot country review, which was of New Zealand.
Okay.
Trade and Gender Review of New Zealand. And we're now doing another trade and gender review, which is of 7 Latin American countries.
Wow.
So our research in that area continues. But you're absolutely right. Gender equality and gender gaps analysis undertaken in OECD is very much of a horizontal activity. The OECD ambassadors meet regularly to discuss the work on gender equality in a group called the Friends of Gender Equality Plus. And so they discuss the work that is going on in a wide range of areas that touch on gender and gender equality. And so in our work, particularly on trade, we've worked in other folks who, we've worked alongside other folks who, for example, specialize in micro and small enterprises. So we did a whole paper on women in trade, women business leaders of small and medium enterprises in trade. And that came out in the OECD SME and Entrepreneurship Outlook publication that really is destined toward the SME community, the SME policymaker community. We also work with many organizations outside OECD. With the WTO, we contributed a chapter on women in aid for trade, aid for trade programs that have a gender focus. We did that with our colleagues working in the WTO Secretariat, and that was part of the global review, Aid for Trade Global Review. And we present our work in many different fora, from APEC to the World Economic Forum, ILO, and of course in our member countries, including New Zealand.
Yeah, very good. So you mentioned earlier that you've been hearing from Indigenous peoples about what inclusive trade might involve from their perspective. Can you talk a little bit more about where these initiatives are going, what's in train, what we can look out for in terms of sharing experiences cross-nationally? Maybe you could elaborate on the initiatives that are happening out of here.
Sure. So first thing, this work stream has just started at OECD, and the OECD Trade Committee agreed for the first time in its history to work on this specific work stream. So that is fairly historic, and that was thanks to the support from particularly New Zealand, who brought along other member countries with them. So we're really at the beginning, teasing out the implications of trade, but this is an important aspect of our work because we know that Indigenous peoples have trade in their DNA. They traded long before they came into contact with Europeans. We know this is the case in Mexico. There's much evidence of that in North America as well. The importance of the canoe in Indigenous communities for transportation, for livelihood, but also for trade. And so we're starting at the OECD by identifying future areas of future research. And we're doing that by discussions with Indigenous groups and with policymakers. So one area is just that, engagement of governments with Indigenous groups. We know that that is done in a certain way in New Zealand with treaty partners. In Canada, that is, there are different groups and different ways of engaging and consulting. And elsewhere, it's done differently. So we want to discuss those different models of engagement and bring those to OECD, where there is a vast difference in experience. In New Zealand and Australia, there's a difference with, for example, countries in Latin America. One of the areas that we want to look into is intellectual property and protection of traditional knowledge. This is a difficult area. There is already a lot going on in the international space And we know that there are concerns in this area on the part of Indigenous peoples. So we want to bring those and discuss what those concerns are and whether we can find responses in that space. Another area that we want to look into is gaps that impede Indigenous businesses from trading, whether those are digital gaps, access to finance, skills gaps, access to business networks. And of course, we need more data. Data on Indigenous people and labor markets, on Indigenous peoples in leadership and in trade.
I just want to finish up by asking you where to from here. So, given the OECD is about knowledge transfer and promulgation of good practices and so on, how do you think the work of communicating and demystifying trade and trade agreements and the benefits of trade, where does that need to go next in terms of bringing communities along with the bureaucrats and the negotiators and so on?
So I think we are going to leave it here for now. You have the slides on Canvas, and also the link to this video is there, so you can continue watching the video. But for the matter of time, we need to open the breakout rooms now and start that exercise, that conversation that you will have. So I'm going to open the breakout rooms now, and we are going to broadcast the slide with the questions, so you have them in your rooms. So let me open the rooms now.
And they'll have 15 minutes?
Yes, so you have 15 minutes. Remember to choose a person to report back. The report back will take about 15 minutes as well.
Right, I think we are all back now. So I hope you had a good discussion. And I think we'll just go in order. So who is the spokesperson for room 1?
So in room
That's
1,
me.
we have Roberto, Hilder, Levia, and Luis.
Yes, that was we 3 in the group, and it was Brazil, El Salvador, and Guatemala. Yeah, we mostly have very equal issues. Like we said that we have a lot of inequality yet, but the women are taking the places and the leadership in a while, and this gap is closing. Well, for Brazil, we have a few initiatives for these small and medium enterprises to access international markets, like Brazil Export Platform. And I'm mostly speaking about the Ministry of Agriculture in Brazil, because that's where I work, and it's what I know more. We have trade missions that support these producers, these small producers, to reach some global markets, and also some capacity building programs to train these small producers and small enterprises to participate in the international trade. Well, Guatemala told about some government supporting these small and medium enterprises to reach this business to export. And also that the Ministry of Economy is increasing the participation for these small and medium enterprises to the international market. And El Salvador told about the government that is promoting these food products from small producers to reach these international markets as well. So that was a bit of our talk in the group.
Thank you, Hilda. Yeah, I think it's really interesting when we have these conversations across different regions, how much overlap there tends to be in terms of the challenges that we're all still facing. Okay, thank you. Room 2.
So in room 2, we have Charm, Claudia, Stefania, Rodrigo, and Gianna.
Okay, so as the only for gender equality perspective, as the only male member of the group, I will be the spokesperson. So as you can see, we still have challenges. So regarding the first question, Peru mentioned that they are working actively with the OECD representative on gender equality and trade at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in order to support her research on what's a reality of the region in terms of inclusiveness on international trade. They also mentioned, Peru also mentioned that their SMEs associations participate in consultations on trade negotiations at the national level. They are represented by regional export committees where the local associations can also participate and give inputs regarding opportunities and challenges they face for international trade. Our colleague from St. Lucia mentioned that they have several programs which incentivize the participation of SMEs on international trade, like loans and capacity building. Suriname also mentioned several programs which are on the same page through the Agricultural Bank and the incentives for digital financing. And our colleague from Costa Rica mentioned that they have several programs as well at the Ministry of Foreign Trade, where they promote international links for SMEs and their participation on trade fairs. From Argentina, the experience that we have is at the let's say we as it was mentioned on the video, we have several international agreements where we included clauses regarding gender equality and the inclusion of the local communities, let's say, on international trade. But as I mentioned on the group, we still face a lot of challenges regarding data collection, because it's usually the case that these women and also indigenous people, they work in the informal sector. So given that there is no way of measuring certain things, it is very difficult to find on the international agreements that we have, let's say, hard commitments regarding these topics. They are always best efforts and cooperation, you know. So regarding data, well, as I mentioned, we still have a few challenges, even though we have our National Bureau of Statistics measuring the participation of women specifically in the labor market. Our colleague from Peru mentioned that 90% of their exporting companies are SMEs, but they only participate on 3 to 5% of the total value of exports. So they still have a challenge in terms of analyzing trade from a gender viewpoint. St. Lucia also shares the same challenge, and they are collecting data on international trade through several national bodies, from which they feed for policy making. And in Costa Rica, they also have their National Bureau of Statistics, and it does have categories which include the gender perspective. That's all. Thank you.
That's all. That's fantastic. Very thorough. Thank you very much. Room 3.
So in room 3, we have Francieli, Katia, Lourdes, Shaquille, and Steffi.
Hello, so I will be the spokesperson today. So in our group we included Argentina, Peru, Jamaica, St. Lucia, and Brazil. And regarding for the first questions, MSMEs mainly participate in trade discussions through business associations and chambers of commerce, which represent their interests. In Argentina, participation tends to be more indirectly through the private sector chambers. In Peru, SMEs can be assessing training in technical assistance programs and participate through business organizations. In Jamaica and St. Lucia, there are several opportunities through national consultations and private sector associations where they can be representatives and actively contribute. And in Brazil is the same. So regarding the second question, most of countries highlighted the role of national statistic offices and ministries of trade in collecting data on business and trade participation. In Peru, there are government platforms with export, import, and tax data on SMEs. In Jamaica and St. Lucia, statistical data is used to identify barriers to trade and support programs, including other initiatives for women entrepreneurs. And in Argentina, there is currently less emphasis on collecting specific data on SMEs participation in trade initiatives, but they are also active on this. And here in Brazil, we have institutions such IBGE, and the Ministry of Development and Trade helps to identify SMEs participation and support and export promotion policies, including initiatives that promote women's participation in trade. And some of them are developed by business associations as CNI. I think my colleague Gabriela will talk a little bit about one of these initiatives that we made here. And that's it. I will pass to Gabriela. Kidding.
Thank you very much. Room 4.
So in room 4, we have Claudia, Fernanda, Carlene, and Nicole.
In group 4, hello, we didn't choose a spokesperson, but I can speak on behalf of the group, and then if other one of my colleagues would like to jump in and complement, then fine. Regarding question 1, well, in our group there was Peru, Belize, Brazil, and El Salvador, and we realized that we have similar mechanisms to include small, medium, micro enterprises in our countries. We have public consultation mechanisms where in which small, medium enterprises, they can join through associations and guilds of exporters as well. Also, what we conduct is we provide training programs and technical assistance to these groups in order for them to be more updated and have more recent information about, for example, the latest developments on trade negotiations or trade and industry policies as well. In our case of Peru, for example, we organize informative rounds, that's how we call it, after each round of negotiation while we are negotiating an FTA. So private sector is informed from the beginning of the negotiation, during the negotiation, and after that, after we conclude the FTA. For example, also in Belize, they have this agency called Beltrade, which is the agency in charge of the export promotion, and they promote the access of information to small and medium enterprises as well. Regarding question 2, we recognize that there are some challenges still to promote the use of data, disaggregated data. But for example, in Belize and Brazil, they told us that they use this data, disaggregated data, to identify the gaps and the challenges, so they can be better informed when they propose to have or to promote technical assistance or other activities in favor of these small and business enterprises. In the case of Peru, for example, we have from Peru, which is the Government Commission for the Promotion of Exports, and this agency is the one that has more, I believe it has more access to data, and that way they supply us with this information so we are better informed and take better decisions when it comes to provide technical assistance to these groups. And also, one one thing that I would like to highlight is data is not only important per se, but also is data plus financial support, because what one challenge that we realize that is common in our countries is that this type of businesses, one of the challenges they face is that they don't have financial support to access to export markets or continue exporting to these markets. So I think that it is not only data and technical assistance, but also financial support that should come with it as well. And that will be all from my side.
Thank you very much, Claudia. If we could hear from room 5, please.
So Diego, Gabriela, Juan Castanelo, and Mornet.
Yes, I will be the spokesperson. And as my colleague mentioned, this is inclusive trade is the agenda that speaks to my heart. So I was very happy to see today's class and to see Jane in here. She is a partner. We are joining efforts with her since the G20 in Brazil 3 years ago, and we have a project together. And let me use my time to report the group discussions and also talk about that to give an example here for Brazil. We had in our group, we had representatives from Paraguay, Dominica, Mexico, and Brazil. We could identify similar organizations and similar challenges. Paraguay highlighted that we need indeed platforms for the MSMEs to participate, and IDB and World Bank are institutions who usually provide this type of support. They also have national surveys, but they are very limited to provide disaggregated data, and there is a high level of informality, which is a challenge regarding this data. Dominica highlighted that there is a small business unit inside the Ministry of Labor that provide technical assistance and training for SMEs, women, and also indigenous people. They provide consultations and meetings and then create evidence for target interventions. And there are also business associations that provide some opportunities for discussions. And Mexico highlighted that the opportunities for MSMEs are usually related to digital technologies, supply chain finance, and sustainability of green certificates. And regarding the statistics, they have Ministry National Statistics of Geography that conducts that. And then for Brazil, it's the same. We have this challenge of engaging small businesses, women, and marginalized groups in trade, and we need those platforms. And CNI works to be one of those platforms. And currently, we have a project named Women in Trade in Latin America and Caribbean. And we are conducting a business survey that women and men can participate, and we want to understand the key challenges that prevent women, especially women, from accessing international markets. This was inspired by a project during G20, because in Brazil, the disaggregated data is very recent in foreign trade statistics. And now we know from 2 years from now, we know that only 14% of exporting companies are led by women. And based on this data, we could advocate better for this inclusion, for the economic importance of public policy and private initiatives designed to correct this gap. And this consultation aims to provide evidence for more target policy in this regard. So you see that the questionnaire is based on the key challenges, and then you click on the challenge that you faced, and then there are follow-up questions to better understand them. So we'll produce a report by the end of the year, and it will be great if I could count on the support of the group to promote the survey so we can reach more countries, because it's Latin America level and it's hard for us to reach other countries. So it would be great if the coordination of the course also allow us to share with the group.
Absolutely. Fantastic. Thank you, Gabriella. And very quickly, room 6.
So we have Firial, Francisco, Manuela, and Sofia.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, well, I will talk about the new platforms that medium and then small and micro enterprises have now to collaborate with the trade initiatives and trade negotiations that in previous eras were not available to connect, because the capabilities uh, to to work on the elaboration or the planation of international trade negotiation were not able, and how our geographic and information institutes are working to develop databases related with small and micro enterprises to know how the commerce affect their they grow and shop, how to say it? They stay at at the market, their stability and the continuous impact in the economic growth. That's a little resume about with what we talk about.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Can I ask those of you who did take notes, which I think quite a few of you did, if you could post them on the discussion board on Canvas so that Jennifer can have a look at that before she comes back with you for tomorrow's session, that would be great. And thank you, Gabriella, for sharing that link. Yes, and we strongly encourage everyone in the cohort to support Gabriella in her work and share that link as widely as possible. We have run a bit over time, but I think that was a really useful and interesting discussion. So could we have a 10-minute break while we get our next speaker set up? You can go and stretch your legs or grab a cup of coffee, and we'll see you back here at 22. Thank you. Okay, hopefully everyone is back because now we are delighted to talk digital trade with the fabulous Stephanie Honey, who is New Zealand's, I would say, leading expert in digital trade. So thank you very, very much for joining us, Steph, and I will hand over to you.
Thank you so much, and tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. It's a real pleasure to be here with this group and talking about one of my favourite subjects, digital trade. So let me just outline what we're going to do today. And I should say that I'd come at this topic as a former New Zealand trade negotiator, but also with the benefit of having had the opportunity to work very extensively with businesses and as part of the wider Asia Pacific regional business community for some 15 years or so now, pardon me, including in the APEC Business Advisory Council, which includes a number of Latin American economies and in sort of broader settings as well. So I hope that the session will be valuable, not just through the lens of a policymaker, but also with a bit of a business flavour as well, because there are a few topics in modern trade that touch on as many sort of important issues of the day as digital trade and the digital economy. So let's dive in. We're going to talk about some very basic building blocks, first of all. What is this thing, digital trade? Probably if you ask the person in the street, they might give you a rather different answer to the one that we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about what some of the barriers and impediments to digital trade are. We're going to look at the rule book for digital trade, which is a very fast-moving area. And then we're going to do some reflections on what this looks like through a development lens, and in particular, of course, for the Latin America and Caribbean region. We're going to have a sort of breakout group-based discussion exercise at the end, which I hope will be some fun, and then we'll come back together and report it back in the sort of final few minutes. Please, as we go through, feel absolutely free to put your questions in the chat. I love to do these sessions in a way that's as interactive as possible. So don't hold back from putting not just your questions, but also your observations and comments into the chat, or feel very free to just turn your microphones on and or your screens and jump in. I think the best learning always happens when people are actively engaged and discussing things, but also I'm sure many of you have got a wealth of knowledge that will really enrich the learning of all of us on this call. So please don't hold back, and excuse my croaky throat. A little touch of asthma here, unfortunately. So apologies in advance for any throat clearing or coughing that I do. Okay, well, let's start with our most basic questions, if I can get the technology to work. What is digital trade? And feel free to pop your answers into the chat while we're thinking about this topic. But let me ask you, first of all, what are some examples of digital trade? Can you think of, if we were meeting in person and I put it to you, to tell me what we were going to be talking about, what would be some case studies of, or examples, real world examples? And I can see somebody's popped into the chat, e-commerce, exactly. And we tend to think of that as platform-based trade. So if I, as an individual, wants to buy, say, a book on Amazon, that's definitely an example of digital trade. Can anybody think of any other examples? Pop your suggestions into the chat there. While you're thinking and writing, digital customs procedures, yeah, absolutely. There's a sort of an enablement aspect to digital trade, isn't there? Streaming services, music, exactly, or Netflix. We all love to watch our online entertainment at home now. But something that you probably don't think about while you're doing that is you're actually importing digital services as you do that. Another great example in the chat there, purchase of e-visas, digital payments, a freelancer providing graphic design services online to international clients. Fantastic examples, exactly. And I think we can see from all of those examples that this is a very wide universe of kinds of trade. And it's really marking a shift from what's traded to how it's traded, essentially. Another great suggestion in there, online education, AI, all of those. So I've popped a few examples on here, Amazon, Netflix, this guy carrying a pickaxe. If you've got teenage children, you'll probably recognize him from the wonderful world of Minecraft. And of course, the sort of greenish logo there, OpenAI. We're now seeing this incredible uptake of large language models, generative AI, as another example. And then also another great example in the chat there, data centers providing services. So we can see that there's a very diverse collection of activities and goods and services that are being provided under the guise of digital trade. And to sort of put it into a more structured format, we can see that throughout the whole trade pipeline, from essentially ideation, concepts, to goods and services, to the way that they're transmitted and consumed and distributed, to sort of the what might be seen as kind of inherently digital services that couldn't exist at all without the internet. We can see throughout that whole trade pipeline, we're seeing this transformation from, you know, what it is that's being traded through to the way that the trade takes place with those digital enablers. And of course, something else that's really unique about digital trade, it's changing all the time. Literally, as we speak, there are probably some amazing new things being invented or commercialized in the world, from generative AI to robotics to even now quantum computing is starting to move out of the laboratory and maybe into commercial applications. So this is another interesting feature of digital trade, which makes it particularly challenging for you as policymakers as to how to keep pace with this rapidly evolving technological picture with, as might be needed, either enabling policy settings or important regulatory safeguards. You know, how do you keep pace with this technological change that's happening very quickly? So how big is this thing, the digital economy, if you want to capture all of those aspects of digital trade that we've talked about? Well, again, the figures are changing very rapidly, and it's really an area where the econometricians and the statisticians are struggling to keep pace as well and to identify what it is that we're talking about. But some recent estimates put it at about, say, 16% of global GDP. That was from an UNCTAD report of a couple of years ago, so probably that figure's even higher now, and well over half of all services trade globally. Again, that's probably an undercount. That was a 2024 figure, so I've seen more recent estimates into the 60s, maybe even as high as 70% of global services trade now being digitally transmitted. The most important sort of dimension of digital trade, which distinguishes it from traditional kinds of trade, is really the cross-border flow of data. So that's the information, the bits and bytes that underpin all of these trade flows, but are actually also a traded asset in and of themselves. So you could think about the data flows as being the lifeblood of digital trade. Without data flowing, you're probably not seeing any trade taking place. And this chart is from an UNCTAD report, but there's been a lot of similar work done by the likes of McKinsey Global Institute and others, trying to sort of map out this incredible transformation that we've seen. So in this graphic, you can see from 2004 to 2024, so over just 2 short decades, this sort of exponential growth in cross-border data flows. So you can see the trends there from only a few, pardon me, wealthy markets now to encompassing much of the global economy and at a much higher order of magnitude than we saw 20 years ago. And even as far back as a decade ago, estimates were that the economic value of these data flows was far more than the value of global goods trade. So what does this growth look like? Well, we can break it down into a number of different baskets. So the first basket we might call e-commerce. Probably if you ask the person on the street, that's what they would identify as digital trade. And when we use that term, it's often used synonymously with digital trade. But for today's purposes, let's think about it as essentially platform-based digital trade flows. Most commonly, people think about this as being a B2C transaction. So a consumer buys something on Amazon, for example, but in fact, the B2B market significantly dwarfs the B2C market. It's worth multiples of that. And overall, we're talking trillions of dollars worth of value. And in fact, the World Economic Forum has estimated that nearly 3/4 of new value creation in the next decade will come through platforms. So it's a really important modality for trade, if you like, and unfortunately also an area where regulation is really lagging. So there are very few internal sort of domestic regulations of these big global platforms and some really significant challenges around things like competition policy, access for small businesses to those platforms, regulation of content and so on. So it's very much at the cutting edge of the regulatory challenge for policymakers. Now, the other really significant growth area is digitally deliverable services. So this is a sort of a new conceptual framework that's been developed in the last few years. The idea of services that could be digitally delivered being deliverable services, and services that are digitally delivered, so digital services or digitally delivered services. Sorry, a lot of semantics here, but I think it's important to note because this trend that we've seen is that services generally are becoming much more digitally deliverable over time. That is, things that you once might not have been able to deliver using digital technologies now can be. And that trend is really growing as well. Even things that you might have thought a few years ago could never be delivered digitally, like surgery, for example. Of course, we now see through the wonders of technology, those services can actually be provided cross-border thanks to technology. And I think it's important to sort of contrast the trends that we're seeing in global goods trade, merchandise trade, where, for example, we've seen this term that McKinsey and Co have used, globalization, so a kind of a general slowing of the hyper growth that we'd seen through the preceding sort of 20 odd years. We're now seeing this kind of static trend, or you know, in the last year or two, a bit more growth, but overall the trend has been relatively muted. And compare that with digitally deliverable services, where there's been, you know, significant and continuing growth. Some of the figures through the pandemic were into double digits. That's slowed down a lot now. I think the estimate for this year is about 6% growth. But even so, a very significant increase in this kind of trade taking place. And of course, one of the things that was mentioned in the excellent suggestions earlier on in the chat, this idea of digital enablement of trade or digital trade facilitation. So we're seeing really significant growth in both platform-based goods trade and the tools that are used to sort of facilitate that. So things like paperless trade, you may have heard of, where electronic documents or data pools are used to administer trade flows, through to things like digital payments, e-invoicing, e-contracts, all of the kind of the paperwork and the kind of tools that are used to enable transactions are now being digitalized. And of course, that itself poses really significant challenges in the real world for things like border agencies dealing with this tidal wave of new, parcel-based trade and so on. So some real policy challenges there and resourcing challenges, particularly for developing economies. So what are we talking about when we refer to digital trade? Well, we've talked about what some examples are, but how to wrap that up in a nice, tidy definition is more challenging. And over the last few years, a number of the large international economic institutions, so the OECD, the WTO, IMF, UNCTAD, have come together and developed both a handbook for how to measure this thing we call digital trade, but also a definition, digitally enabled transactions of trade in goods and services, whether digitally or physically delivered. So that really captures all of those different elements that I put on the earlier slide about the transformation along the pipeline. Now, I mentioned that the WTO and OECD and others had developed this handbook on measuring digital trade. And the reason that they did that is because it's extremely hard to count. What is digital trade and how do you actually measure it? It sort of builds on one of the challenges that if you've worked in services trade, you'll know very well. Services are also very hard to count in international trade statistics, but digital is even more so. And so one of the challenges is there's no good fit with the very familiar ways that we count traditional trade, particularly goods trade. Obviously, you can see a container that's full of goods with a particular value going, from one market to another. But when it comes to digital, these flows may not be visible. They may be sort of routed through multiple different countries before they arrive in the final destination. They may be provided through commercial presence in another market, which is very hard to measure. And so there are a lot of imponderables about how to count this thing. I really highly recommend the OECD handbook as a way to try to figure out what you're talking about, because of course it's not only hard to measure, but it's hard to know if it's growing or perhaps needs some tweaking in your policy settings to enable that if you don't know what you're counting. So this is a work in progress for most economies around the world, including New Zealand. We're only just at the point of actually unpacking how big is our digital economy, how big is our digital trade. But APEC has done some fantastic work in that space, which you can definitely just Google on the APEC website and look into how that has been developed. Another really interesting thing about digital trade is that it really upends a lot of the way that we think about the economics of trade, and for businesses as well. So often business models are quite different in the digital economy to more traditional trade models. There are often low cost to entry. There are all sorts of unusual things about digital markets, network effects, competition, and so on. But also something that's very interesting, I think, is that individual consumers can now be directly engaged in trade in a way that was very hard before this technology. You know, you tended to have large exporters, large importers, and consumers were really the end consumers of a product, but that had gone through multiple different stages of sort of middlemen, essentially. But now, of course, we have this model of micro multinationals where individuals can easily have global reach with very low entry costs. And that changes a lot of the way that we think about trade policy as well, because how do you design enabling policies, settings, and regulations to deal with these much smaller, both exporters and consumers? And also, one of the other interesting things is we're starting to see a lot of value creation that may not necessarily have a dollar value attached to it. So, for instance, if you use a search engine, or often these days a large language model, you're definitely consuming a service there, you're getting a benefit, but you may not necessarily be paying financially for that. But of course, there is definitely some value changing hands, not just the benefit you gain, but you are sharing your data with those companies, and they are able to extract value from that. So some really interesting sort of intellectual considerations there, even if not directly translating into trade policy. Another of the very interesting dimensions of digital trade, one of the reasons why I think it's so fascinating as an area of trade policy, but also so difficult for policymakers to come up with really good policy settings, is because it's one of these very significant transformational, cross-cutting, sort of horizontal changes that we see in the world that touches on many different aspects of our lives that have nothing to do with trade. So maybe in the chat, you might like to put your ideas about what some of the non-trade concerns are that have an impact on digital trade, or the way governments regulate in this area that really have nothing to do with trade. So are there dimensions of digital trade that you can think of that, you know, we see regulation or we see restrictions driving what you know, trade can flow, that really are not driven by the economics of trade policy or the legal implications of trade policy? Can you think of any examples of that? One example, we can see the lady in the picture peeping through a peephole. You know, there are obviously concerns around cybersecurity, for example, where we see governments regulating that really, and somebody, great minds think alike there, someone's just popped that idea into the chat. Are there any other things like cybersecurity that you can see governments regulating which might have an impact on trade? Yep, another great suggestion there, data protection. And I guess a sort of related aspect of that, privacy. So we see lots of privacy regulation. It definitely has an impact on businesses trying to operate across a border, but it's not necessarily trade policy per se, is it? Any other thoughts occur to you? Well, let me put a few ideas down. So we've talked about privacy. There's also a lot of ideas about sovereignty. I mean, also lots of definitions about what's meant by that, but around control over data in particular, but also a sort of idea around national sovereignty and security, economic security. A lot of these ideas that we're now seeing, unfortunately, through the lens of, for example, forced, technological decoupling, lots of concerns about where your physical IT technology is coming from, where data flows go, connected devices, all sorts of issues around that. Where do you get your chips from and the critical minerals that are used to make those? So lots and lots of issues in that space, changing all the time as well. There's also a whole lot of issues around online safety, trust. If you're in the political world, you're very concerned often about misinformation or disinformation. We've unfortunately seen in the real world, a lot of sort of bad actors putting around misinformation and disinformation around elections and so on. There are a whole lot of issues around economic development to do with access to infrastructure and access to technology stacks and inclusion. And then, of course, something in touching across all of these domains, what are some of the unintended consequences of new technologies? Perhaps just because they haven't been around for very long and we don't fully understand them, the implications or the impacts, but things like AI and quantum computing, lots of issues that are being thrown up there, which are really important, but may not necessarily be related to trade. However, over time, we're very likely to see regulatory action by governments across all of these areas, which will have an impact on businesses trying to do business, but may not necessarily be a kind of a trade policy concern. Before we move on to trade barriers, are there any questions? Please feel free to put them in the chat, or just put your microphone on and ask if you've got any questions. I'll give you a few minutes to pop those in. Okay, I'm not seeing any questions, but please do feel free to put your hand up or ask if you want to. So we know a little bit now about what digital trade itself looks like, but what do the barriers to it look like? Well, these, as well as being hard to measure and hard to define, digital trade can also be a slippery customer when it comes to trying to identify what the barriers are. Now, in the literature, and often if you talk to businesses, the biggest barriers are in the area of data. So this is the lifeblood, the thing that drives and enables all kinds of digital trade. And unfortunately, it's an area where we're seeing not just increasing regulation, but also increasing barriers to cross-border data flows. So there are sort of two main ideas here. The first one is restrictions on data flowing across a border. And then there's also another idea that you might have heard this term, forced data localization, or sometimes just called data localization. So this is the idea that where data is processed or stored can also be regulated. For example, you might be selling a digital service into a particular market, or Honey Consulting, Stephanie Honey, might be trying to sell some trade policy services to you in El Salvador, and I might find that there are requirements on me to store your data, or if there's a commercial transaction, I might be required to hold that related data in the market. And across the literature, I've put on the slide there a great chart from a really fantastic report that's recently been produced by the OECD and WTO on the economic implications of data regulation. Highly recommend that, written by one of the gurus in this area, Javier Lopez Gonzalez, who works at the OECD. He's just amazing. He and his team have done a lot of work trying to unpack the nuances of both of these areas, the data flow and the data localization. And as you'll read from that report, there are lots of nuances about the way that governments are regulating in this area now. about where data has to be stored or where copies have to be retained, conditional flow regimes where you might be able to have data flowing, but it's got to be accessible and so on. We don't have time to go into that, but I highly recommend that report to understand some of the nuances there. Now, as well as the sort of overt data regulation, we can also see restrictions that don't really look like trade barriers or data restrictions, but have that effect. So one thing might be a privacy regulation, where often, the requirements around how personally identifiable data or personal information is managed have the effect of restricting data flows. There might be special requirements around particularly sensitive categories of data, like financial services data or health data, which might be for very valid reasons. They might be, prudential restrictions or, privacy restrictions for health data, but nevertheless have this impact on sort of cross-border trade, cybersecurity rules, national security requirements. Again, these have the effect of limiting flows of data, but may not necessarily be an obvious trade barrier. Other restrictions that we can see on digital trade flows can be things like e-payments. That's a very, very restrictive area. There might be rules around incumbents, banks having, more rights to provide these sorts of payment services and so on. There might be restrictions on content. Some kinds of particularly platform-based trade might have restrictions on content, or in the video gaming world, there might be limitations on the kinds of images that can be shown. And then there are some more sort of traditional services type barriers. So things like local presence requirement, joint venture requirements, even where, services might be waitlist, they might be cloud-based services, you might still find that you need to have a local presence in a market or be in a sort of the corporate structure or joint venture structure of the business requires some sort of limitation. And then overall, we see the idea of what I've described as a digital noodle bowl. So the sort of growing regulatory burden in this space, where individual regulations might be no bad thing, they might have legitimate reasons, but the overall impact on small businesses in particular trying to operate in global markets can be really overwhelming, and growing fragmentation in this space as well. So just to illustrate the sort of restrictions that we see in this area, this is, again, some great work that's been done by the OECD looking at what the restrictions are in digital services. So not capturing all of digital trade, but as a kind of proxy for digital trade. They have developed this Digital Services Trade Restrictiveness Index. And you can see on the left there, on my screen anyway, the Latin America and Caribbean region, unlike many, many regions in the world, has actually had a pretty steady, even a modest decline in restrictiveness. But unfortunately, the actual absolute level where these restrictions are pitched could be lower. And then if we break it down by where these barriers actually lie, you can see in the chart on the right, the barriers to infrastructure, so this captures data flows, is by far the biggest category. But then there are also big restrictions around transactions, around IP, around payment systems. So, it's a very rich area for trade reforms, because unfortunately we're seeing, this sort of both increasing trade, but also increasing restrictiveness over time. And I think another really important thing to bear in mind is you might think, okay, well, restrictions are growing, who cares? We are an agricultural economy, or we're a manufacturing economy. Digital really isn't important for us. But actually, we can see that there's been this digital transformation across the whole economy. Whether you're in agricultural, manufacturing, or textiles, digitalization is coming for every sector. And that means that the restrictions that we see on digital trade, particularly things like back office services, financial services or technical services, even in sort of old economy old economy sectors like agriculture have an impact on trade costs. So you can see, I think this is an absolutely fascinating chart. This is from that report that I mentioned earlier about the costs of data regulation. And you can see, even in something like agriculture and mining, which I know are very important to many Latin American and Caribbean economies, you know, a 4% trade cost increase with every extra 0.04% increase in that digital services trade restrictiveness index, and on through, you know, the forestry products, food, petrochemicals. So, you know, this is something that policymakers actually need to get right for the health of the whole economy, not just for the kind of crazy tech startups and so on. Another really important thing to bear in mind, and I'm sure that this will be very much at front of mind for many of you, trade policies all very well, but actually a lot of the challenges in this space, particularly in developing economies, are around domestic policy settings and capabilities. So things like infrastructure, basic regulatory building blocks, skills, digital literacy, the ability of your businesses to actually engage in the digital economy, talent flows, so having enough you know, AI experts in your economies or fintech experts. These things are as important in terms of digital trade frictions as trade policy settings. And, you know, unfortunately, many of these things require huge levels of sort of investment and support, and they're multi-year projects. And so that makes this issue around digital inclusion and the digital divide particularly acute and painful for many developing economies. Are there any questions on the barriers before we move on to some of the rule book? Okay, well, feel free, as always, pop your questions in the chat or comments, or put your microphones on. So we're going to spend a few minutes now just looking at some of the rules for digital trade. And this is also an extremely rapidly changing area. It's a really fascinating, if you're a trade negotiator or a regulatory enthusiast, this is one of the most fascinating areas of modern trade policy as well. But let me start with a threshold question. I mean, I've just talked about this incredible growth that we've seen, you know, amazing surges of data flows, all kinds of digital trade. So really, why do we need digital trade rules? Well, the answers, unfortunately, go back to some of the very basic building blocks of trade policy, and I've put them on the slide here. So the first thing is, the ideal, if you talk to any of your businesses, what's more important even than what the barriers are is predictability and certainty. They want to know what the terms and conditions of doing business are, because then that enables them to plan, to invest, to innovate. So the most important thing in the digital world is predictability as well. And unfortunately, without a good set of trade rules or trade architecture in the form of, you know, good regulation or clarity, it's very hard for businesses to do that. So that's a reason to put trade rules in, even if markets are relatively open. We can also enable new business models and new opportunities, new inclusion opportunities, if we have good trade rules architecture, because a lot of the frictions that we see in the real world, commercially and, you know, across borders, relate to a lack of interoperability. So things like standards, kind of regulatory requirements. If we don't have a sort of a seamless operating environment across borders, a lot of those opportunities can't be fully taken up, can't be realised. Unfortunately, as I've also just talked about, we're also seeing rising digital trade barriers and even protectionism. And then lastly, with these new technologies, the implications of which we may not fully understand yet, it's possible, definitely not certain, but possible that we might need new rules architecture for those. So things like AI, but even more sort of old-fashioned digital technologies like platforms. As I said, a lot of the areas of sort of cross-border regulation, there around competition policy and so on are really still very nascent. We have not developed good cross-border architecture in those areas yet either. So we've seen a very changeable landscape in this space. A lot of the basic principles and the basic rule book in the WTO applies to the digital world. There has been a sort of a body of dispute settlement cases that have affirmed the WTO rulebook is technology agnostic, so it applies to the digital world as much as it does to the physical world. And then there have also been some specific work streams on sort of electronic commerce, as it was called in the WTO. But really, there's been this growing sense that, okay, those rules were amazing, they were prescient, they're technologically neutral, but they don't quite capture what we need them to do in the digital world. So over the last 20 or so years, we've started to see this accelerating rulemaking, firstly in FTAs, particularly, you know, some very notable FTAs like CPTPP, the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement Trans-Pacific Partnership, which of course includes a number of Latin American economies. But then more latterly, and this has really been since the late 2010s and really actually since about 2020, we've seen this huge acceleration of innovative digital trade policy making in both the WTO and in these so-called digital economy agreements, which I'm going to talk about. I've already touched on this. Which rules apply in the WTO? Well, all of them, but some more than others. I won't go through this in detail, apart from in a couple of areas which I'll come to, but I think it's worth reflecting on the cleverness of some of the authors of the current WTO rulebook. I've got a picture there of a fax machine. You're all probably far younger than I am and can't even remember a fax machine. But just to say, that was the height of technological advancement at the time many of those WTO agreements were developed. So the internet did exist, but it really wasn't a thing, as the kids say. You know, faxes were about as fancy as it got. So it really is quite amazing that a lot of these basic WTO agreements, the GATS and the GATT, actually do work pretty well for digital trade. But two things that will be very prominent in literally the next week. I'm sure many of you are aware that we have a WTO ministerial conference happening next week, and two important digital issues will be covered there. One is this terribly named thing, the WTO e-commerce moratorium, or to give it its full technical name, the moratorium on customs duties on electronic transmissions. It's a terrible mouthful, and there are many areas of ambiguity about what this captures, but essentially it's the idea of whether or not you can charge tariffs on digital goods or digital products. In the interest of time, I won't go into this, but again, there's a wealth of amazing material out there about this, produced by the likes of the OECD, by other big institutional bodies. UNCTAD has done some work in this space, and also by the business community. So the ICC, the International Chambers of Commerce, have written lots of really interesting papers about this from a business perspective. But essentially, this moratorium, which has prevented the application of tariffs on digital trade through most of the history of the internet, is due to terminate at the ministerial conference MC14 next week. Now, the work that the OECD has done in this area suggests that that would actually have a terrible impact on global trade and development. There are different perspectives on this. Some WTO members, particularly India, Indonesia, South Africa, and a few others, Brazil, I think in the past has also been a proponent of this, argue that in fact they're missing out on lots of customs revenues here, and so we should get rid of the moratorium. Personally, I support the OECD analysis, but you know, there are many different views on this, and there's a very clear development challenge here as well. So I'll leave it there for now, but I'm very happy to recommend lots of great readings in this area if you want to swat up on it. I'm sure you'll be seeing a lot of media coverage about it in the next week. And then the other really important thing to mention in the context of MC14 is this new global agreement, well, involving maybe around 70 or so, 70 to 80 participants, but accounting for a very large share of trade. WTO members and a plurilateral have come up with a new agreement on electronic commerce. Again, this is very contentious. Some countries are not happy about seeing this plurilateral deal and have so far been very reluctant to see it brought into the WTO rulebook. So that is another of the issues that will definitely be discussed next week. But it sets a kind of a benchmark, a sort of a bottom, lowest common denominator, a set of global rules in some really important areas like digital trade facilitation. So again, very happy to make recommendations if you want to know more about that. But I think one of the most interesting things that we've seen in terms of trade policy development is the advent of these new kind of innovative digital economy agreements, or DEAs. So about well over half of FTAs now have digital trade provisions. And in fact, if you looked just at a snapshot of recent FTAs, it would be virtually all of them. Many of them go even further and have e-commerce chapters. And over time, we've seen wider and deeper trade rules in this area, particularly around data flows. And I think I will not go into this in great detail, but it's important for you to understand that the way countries, particularly sort of in three main areas, think about cross-border data regulation is really quite a different way of looking at the world. Their sort of regulatory philosophy in this area is very different, and many commentators put them into these three broad buckets of a kind of approach. I think these names that I've put here, the US model, the China model, the Brussels model, or the EU model, are really becoming quite outdated now. They were sort of true up to a point a few years ago, but there's really been even more evolution since then. But let's look at them in this rather simplified way for now. So the first model, the CPTPP model, or the US model, has as its default the idea that data should be able to flow freely. We should not be forcing countries to localize data. But there are kind of vertical exceptions to that, in the sense of a specific exception to that general default of free flowing for legitimate public policy exceptions. So you can imagine one legitimate public policy exception, for example, might be privacy regulation or national security. Now, the important concept here is that this exception is limited. So there's very little, if you like, policy space for countries to, deal themselves out of free flow. And this was motivated by a sense that we need business to be able to operate freely, so we need a very light touch regulation in this space. The next big model comes from another Asia-Pacific mega regional FTA, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, which is Southeast Asian, North Asian, and Australia, New Zealand. Oh, I think I've just stopped sharing for some reason. Not sure why that happened, apologies. So this is often called the China model. It looks on the face of it very similar to the US model, but the distinction here is that it's got a much broader set of exceptions, vertical exceptions. So they're self-judging, they create a lot of policy space for governments, essentially to derogate from this free flow of data idea, and very much driven by the idea of governments needing to retain flexibility, social control, sovereignty, all of those ideas. And then latterly, the Brussels model, which until recently simply did not engage on cross-border data flow issues or regulation issues in trade agreements, driven by this idea that data protection and privacy are human rights, and so they're not something you'd negotiate away in a trade agreement. They are absolute. But interestingly, we've seen in recent years the EU starting to shift a little bit more towards a sort of a CPTPP or RCEP model. So just very briefly, these new style agreements, I've popped on the slide some examples there, and in the kind of I guess you could say the Latin America and Caribbean region, we've seen some economies participating in this new style of agreement. So, for instance, Chile is part of this, the sort of poster child of this model, the Digital Economy Partnership Agreement, and some other Latin American countries seeking to join that. There's also the Pacific Alliance has done a very forward-leaning digital chapter in its FTA with Singapore, and so on. So I won't go through too much of the detail of this, just conscious of time, but basically these digital economy agreements, this new style of agreement that superseded the old FTA e-commerce chapters, it's just about digital trade, so it's not really looking at the sort of more comprehensive FTA elements. It's designed as a sort of a living response to this rapidly evolving regulatory and technological market. So it's got lots of some areas of binding rules, for example, around data governance, but also lots of areas where it's essentially creating conversations among the participants about how to approach some of these fast-changing issues. So there's a lot of cooperation, best endeavours, kind of mechanisms to enable that, sandboxes and so on. Essentially a new way of developing policies in this area. And I'll leave you to read this in your own time, but essentially the approach that these agreements try to use is to enable trade end to end, so things like some of that digital trade facilitation, to foster trust, so consumer trust, business trust, government trust, through a whole lot of different mechanisms, but also to put these new digital economy technologies and models into the social context. So there's often provisions around inclusion, around sort of online safety and so on. And then lastly, recognising that technology is changing. There's lots about innovation, emerging technologies, how we can design good policy responses to these changes and so on. So that brings me to our last segment, and we're shortly going to go into some breakout groups to have a talk about all the things you've just heard. But before we do that, just to set the scene a little bit, I think just to build on some comments that I've made earlier, this is a very interesting space for development, for economic development. It holds both incredible promise for economic development and for inclusive growth and more sustainable growth, but also some really significant and daunting challenges. So if you can get it right, it really unlocks the world, for your small businesses, for your women entrepreneurs, for your Indigenous communities, something that's really important for New Zealand. We see a lot of sort of Māori economic development opportunities in the digital realm. But also there are some really significant challenges around infrastructure and connectivity, around even the most sort of basic regulatory building blocks, and things. These are challenges, I should say, not just for developing economies, but even in New Zealand. So, for instance, paperless trade. We're a huge goods exporter. We want to be able to use technology to facilitate that, to lower trade costs. But even we are finding, well, our regulation isn't quite fit for purpose. We need to go painstakingly through existing regulations to update them. These are really significant challenges. But also for developing countries, they might not have some of the most basic critical building blocks, for instance, around cybersecurity regulation or around electronic transactions frameworks, things that you would not want to be trying to do digital trade without, or you would not be able to have a seat at the table of many sort of trade negotiations unless you had these basic regulatory building blocks in place. There's also a huge domestic capacity gap. So things like skills, literacy, a sort of technology and startup infrastructure, talent, all of these things, very easy for people like me to talk about, but the reality of fostering those things on the ground is a huge task. And then just keeping pace with change. So AI, quantum, all of these new technologies that will have a big impact whether we like it or not. Keeping pace with that, being able to leverage them for development is not easy. So where is your region in this world of digital trade? Well, as a proxy for that, I thought it would be interesting to look at a really fantastic new data set that the WTO has developed. It's called the Digitally Delivered Services Exports Data Set, or data set. And so I've put on this chart this is their country grouping, South and Central America and the Caribbean. You can see the trend up to 2024 has generally been upwards. That's amazing, so good to see. Of course, beneath that average, there are some economies that are doing superbly, maybe some that are really struggling. But overall, as a region, if we compare that to world growth, although the trend is definitely great, actually that region, South and Central America and the Caribbean, is lagging the growth trend of the world overall. So clearly good performance, but more could be done. And then if we break it down into what kind of trade are we seeing in this space, the winner by a significant margin is this category called other business services. So that's essentially all the things that sort of professional services, law, accounting, consulting, technical trade-related services, lots of the backbone services that make business go fall into this category. So again, really important to tackle some of the barriers, because this is also one of the areas where we see some of the greatest restrictions. So with that said, I'm going to ask our amazing digital technical experts, Juanita and Suzanne, to break you out into discussion groups. But here's what I'd like you to talk about in your groups. So what I thought was probably the most interesting would be for you to identify a few real world challenges that you can see in your own economies. So it might be, expensive internet access or a lack of digital payments. There might not be much use of paperless trade or the right enabling regulations for paperless trade, whatever it might be. So identify your sort of universe of problems, and then have a chat about what you could do about them. What is needed? Is it domestic legislative reform? Is it new trade agreements? Could you leverage those trade agreements to get some capacity building, or to, apply some good pressure to change your own policy settings? So just have a think about essentially what's the strategy here. You can see there are problems. What would you do about them? So, you don't have to be precise on the numbers or the answers, but just have a think about, where is your country going in this space? So with that, if I may hand over to our breakout group experts, we'll just spend, I don't know, Juanita, how much time you had in mind for this, and then we can come back together and do a debrief.
Yes, I thought maybe 15 minutes, and then we have 15 minutes for the conversation. Yes. Perfect. So I can open the rooms now unless there are any questions.
Yes, I was just going to say, before you go, if you've got any questions about this exercise or anything we've talked about, please feel free to jump in.
No, it seems that there are no questions. So let's open the rooms now.
Everybody is back. Go.
Shall I go?
Yep, go for it.
Sorry. Okay, well, thank you very much, everybody, for coming back. I hope you had some good, interesting discussions in your breakout groups. We can go group by group if people are comfortable to do that or report back. I know you might not very enjoy putting your cameras on, or speaking. If that's the case, you can type your answer into the chat, but otherwise, could we have some volunteers or a volunteer from Juanita, the groups, group 1, 2, 3 or something,
Yes.
or how that, yeah. Okay,
We
so
have
could we
group.
please have someone from group 1 kindly share some of what you talked about? Doesn't have to be a full report, just some of the problems you talked about and maybe some of the solutions. So is there someone from group 1 who would be comfortable to do that? Just put your microphone on and share with the wider group, please.
So in group 1, we had Francieli, Lourdes, Mornet, and Yana.
Wonderful. Go ahead, please.
Well, okay, we didn't choose anybody to speak, but I could see if I could summarize what was discussed. Okay, from our colleague in Brazil, she said that for question 1, they have issues with equal internet access, especially in rural and urban areas, and that's one of the issues that we all faced. There's regulatory complexity for digital services and cross-border trade, low digital adoption among SMEs. So some of our solutions, investment in broadband and digital inclusion, more harmonized and clean digital trade regulations. Our colleague, Lord, sorry, I didn't get where she was from. She actually said that the digital economy, sorry, is quite well because they have Mercado Libre. I'm sorry if I didn't pronounce it properly. Um, they have a lot of digital payments all around the country, and the regulation has progressed. Also, due to that, they have experienced we have expensive internet access and the infrastructure is not available to the entire country. They have a strong sector for export, especially in services based on knowledge, but they can expand on it a bit more. Well, for St. Lucia, we spoke about for question 1, we have skills shortages, infrastructure gaps, and digital divides. To combat these issues, we have better domestic policies, literacy program, especially for the rural and the urban areas, and that we can prioritize trainings within the workforce in cybersecurity, programming, AI, etc. For the Jamaican counterpart, again, we have similar issues. One of the challenges is addressing high costs and uneven internet access. They said that they're still paper-based as opposed to digital. So that's one of the problems that they face, especially within the public service. Domestic assets with digital trade rules could help to address these challenges. For the Dominica, some problems, again, digital platforms, platform for payments. They said that it could be more user-friendly, and also they could incorporate consumer protection acts within the country. I hope I summarized it properly. Thanks.
That's a wonderful job. Thank you so much. What a comprehensive and interesting report, and really fascinating to hear lots of common things, but also some different things as well across the different economies. And I guess this is we have representatives from a very broad range of economy sizes and characteristics in this group. Thank you so much. Let's turn to the other groups now. And if I could just get you to very quickly, if there are any things that you talked about you think are interesting that have not been mentioned, would love to hear about that, either challenges or solutions. So if there's nothing, if people have already covered what you have talked about, that's absolutely fine. No need to say anything, but is there anybody from room 2 who'd like to add in any new ideas or content?
Yes, thank you. So in group 2, we were people from Peru, Costa Rica, Brazil, and Saint Lucia. And I think in the region in general, we have very similar challenges regarding internet access in rural areas and other. but for example, here in Peru, I know that in rural areas there is this company Starlink that they provide special internet, but I think it's quite expensive for them to access. Or there some about other ideas. Our colleague from Costa Rica mentioned the limited adoption of digital payments by SMEs, and also some legal some. In Brazil, for example, they have fragmented regulation regarding digital economy. And I think for the solutions regarding agreements or others is like to use digital agreements to expand market access and also to share best practices in regulation. We can also work on regulatory cooperation in not only in agreements, but also in our integration schemes, like, for example, the Pacific Alliance or the Andean Community, to lower these regulations constraints regarding digital trade. And also in Peru, we will be very soon part of the Digital Economic Partnership Agreement. And also we are working on to implement the UNCITRAL model laws for e-commerce and also for digital transfer, I think. And also our colleagues from Brazil and San Lucia and Costa Rica also mentioned difficulties regarding regulation. And also I think it's important not only at international level, but also in our countries to how to regulate consumer protection when it's using consumers protection regarding e-commerce. For example, I was mentioning that maybe in other countries also that the use of TikTok or WhatsApp for businesses, it's very informal, so consumers are not legally protected doing these transactions. So I think this is something also we can work on international level.
That's great. Thank you. That's a really interesting insight, because as you say, a lot of those channels are very easily accessible by the sellers and the buyers, but a very unregulated space. So that's fantastic. Thanks so much. Great report back there. Is there anybody from room 3 who feels brave enough to share any other things that haven't been mentioned, or new ideas, interesting comments that came up in your discussion?
Yes, I'm from group 3. So we have people from Paraguay, El Salvador, Jamaica, and Guyana. In these countries, we have the same problem regarding internet access and also infrastructure, but I want to focus in those particular challenges from each country. In Paraguay, for example, we have a high level of informality. So the economy is cash based. So we have a difficulty moving towards a more digital economy. In Salvador, they mentioned that they have a shortage of skilled technicians and developers, so a lack of workforce to develop this digital economy. And Jamaica then mentioned that they have a low trust in digital system with a huge emphasis on aging population. In Guyana also mentioned the capacity constraints in digital skills and also systems. Regarding the solutions, in Paraguay, we are investing heavily in digital infrastructure through public-private partnerships, and also relying on the international cooperation for technical cooperation. And also we are having huge campaigns regarding formalizing the economy, giving better products or easier to use products for people to move towards a digital economy and also a more formal economy. In Salvador, a possible solution could be the development of local tech ecosystems, production capacity. In Jamaica, that they mentioned the process to build trust in digital systems regarding consumer protection, cybersecurity as well. And in Guyana, they mentioned that they have capacity building initiatives, including AI-focused programs and the digitalization of government process, transition from paper-based to digital transaction systems.
That's
Thank you.
great.
Yes.
Thank you. And really interesting to hear so much activity going on to build the capacity. Also, I must say, I love that you and Claudia from Peru both talked about the role of international cooperation and these trade agreements as a way to, to sort of upskill each individual country. So that's really great news for trade policy making, I think. Could I please have group? Are we up to group 4 now? Sorry, I've sort of lost track a little bit. Yeah,
Yes,
group
group
4
4.
would be wonderful if you could, somebody there feels brave enough to give us a short update.
So Elisa, Francisco, and Sofia.
Oh, I think you may be on mute, possibly. It wouldn't be a digital trade conversation if we didn't have at least one person on mute, would it? So please go
Hello,
ahead.
now?
Yes,
Now,
perfect.
can you
Thank you
hear
so
me?
much.
Okay. Okay. So we were discussing the situation of the digital trade with Mexico and El Salvador. Pretty much we have the same challenges related to the internet access and digital capabilities. However, I would like to share the experience of El Salvador. We have an e-commerce law since 8 years, and these years from 2024 to 2026, we have taken very interesting initiatives. For example, we have a cybersecurity law and as a private data protection law that is inspired on the GDPR. So we are, because before we have some regulations in the consumer protection law, but not, about security, about data access, but now is more specialized, and we have an agency, a specific agency that overview these kind of topics. So we have also AI law. So I think we already created a framework, a really good framework to promote and to regulate the e-commerce here in El Salvador, because we have also some regulations related to e-payments as well. But let's see what happens in the future about if we need to improve these regulations or and what is the impact in the economics. Thank you so
Great.
much.
So that's so interesting. Thank you very much. What a great report. And I think it really illustrates the challenge of, even if you know what you want to do, actually putting it into practice and changing laws and setting up agencies is very tricky, isn't it? And takes a lot of time and energy. Thanks so much. And then is there one more group as well, or how many more groups? Sorry.
Yes, we do have another group.
Okay. Well, the last group then, if there's somebody who kindly would like to share with us any interesting insights from your discussion, that would be great.
So group 5 is Charm, Fernanda, Hilder, and Carlene. And we have another group, group 6.
Oh, another group as well. Okay, sorry, I thought there were.
Katia, Manuel, and Rodrigo.
Okay, so group 5, is there anybody who would like to share what you talked about?
I will share a little bit about our group.
Great.
I'll try to summarize here. We had Brazil, Belize, Dominica, and Suriname. And so in our group, we identified some common challenges across countries, especially limited digital infrastructure, unequal internet access, and gaps in digital skills. In some cases, like Suriname, infrastructure constraints are a major bottleneck, while Belize also highlight the need to expand connectivity and strengthen cybersecurity. Dominica emphasize that digital transformation is still a gradual process for them. And in terms of solution, countries are investing in broadband and 5G expansion, promoting digital skills and training programs, and advancing digitalization of public services. Brazil, for example, we have progress in a paperless trade and digital certification system, helping to reduce bureaucracy and improve efficiency. And I think overall, strengthening infrastructure skills and digital regulation is key to advance the digital economy, where I think could be a good definition for the discussion of our group.
Thanks so much. That was excellent. So true. You know, it's really interesting to hear the same things coming up again and again, the infrastructure, the capability, training, all of those things, changing government sort of architecture and settings. Really, really great. Thanks so much. And last but not least, our Group 6 colleagues, if you would kindly be happy to share, we'd love to hear your thoughts as well.
Yes, so we have identified, the three challenges would be, infrastructure and internet access gap, urban versus rural areas, and the investment challenges, lack of transparency and high perceived risk from the viewpoint of consumers, and also geopolitics, because data localization and infrastructure for digitally based operations are becoming increasingly geopolitical. Some of our countries do have specific governing bodies over these areas, others don't. So the situation is quite mixed. Regarding what we need, regulatory harmonization within the state, capacity building and regulatory cooperation, interoperability for digital trade in different stakeholders involved in foreign trade, and also AI rules or regulations and enough enforcement. So in this area, budgetary constraints remain a big challenge ahead.
Thanks so much. And so true. I completely agree. That was an excellent readout, but yeah, some very, very relevant points there. We might have the best of ideas and ambitions to regulate and put in place all the right infrastructure and everything, but at the end of the day, there's that investment and financial resourcing challenge, isn't there? Well, look, that has been fantastic. I do apologize. We've gone a little bit over time, but it was just so fascinating to hear all of those reports from the breakout groups, so many commonalities. You know, we can feel daunted by the big job of work that's ahead of us, but also I do think, you know, it's a worthwhile effort. There's so much promise in the digital economy. So let me leave it there. I hope you've enjoyed it. I would be very happy to share any further resources, direct you to further reading if there are particular areas you would like to explore. But thank you so much for your kind attention and engagement today. You've been great. And good luck with the rest of the course.
Kia ora, Steph. Thank you so much. And thank you all the scholars for your very enthusiastic and thoughtful participation. It is, as Steph said, fascinating to hear from all of you about what's happening in your regions. So yes, we have gone over time. I will close with a very quick karakia. Kia tau, kia tātou katoa, te aiao, te aroha, me te marutou, tihe mauri ora. So back again, same place tomorrow for gender and trade. So yes, have a good evening, and yeah, thanks again, Steph, and thanks, Juanita. Ka kite.
Thank you, everyone. Ka kite.